Hi, I'm ED-SKaR, and I won this Chiha tank by Warlord Games to give my Japanese force a little kickstart. It is a 1/56 scale wargaming kit that you can build as either the earlier Chiha or the later Chiha Shinhoto. As we get stuck into the kit, we'll find out you can make it somewhat modular and switch between both hull tops and turrets, but I'll explain as we go. The instructions are really good and even have the location and examples for the transfers, which is nice when you're dealing with a language that's foreign to you, which Japanese is to me. Oddly, the sprue part numbers are not on the sprues themselves, only on this key at the beginning of the instruction sheet, which is unusual, but actually this didn't slow me down in the slightest. The sprues, as expected of a modern kit, are well moulded. There are some points with a tiny bit of flashing, but they clean up just as easy as a mould line with the back of a knife. The detail is good with some fairly fine surface detail and not a lot of small pieces, as it is a wargaming kit, not a display model kit. Getting stuck into building is a very familiar process. The track assemblies build onto a side plate with the road wheels moulded on. The drive sprocket is two pieces which key together, and the tracks are even simpler because they only have an upper and lower piece. Now the very front of each piece of track is cut away, and the corresponding bits of track are moulded as part of the drive sprocket. This does make for a very secure and well-fitting track in comparison to other kits. Unfortunately, some of the way that this piece is molded means that some of those track teeth are correctly oriented to the track link, but those molded at an angle are forced to have the track teeth in line with the molding, which means they're not in line with the track. The upper and lower hull fit together nicely, as long as you clean up those sprue gates. To cover the front and back, there are some smaller cover pieces that have the detail molded on, and these only fit securely if you put them in the correct places and the right way up, so do check the instructions or pictures to make sure. You can, at this point, stick on the track assemblies, but I like to keep them separate for painting. For the back of the hull, there is an optional storage box, which I like the look of. The lid can only go on the correct way, and it's hard to work out which way the correct way is, but the hinges go against the hull where the gap in the box is. And that gap gets covered then by the entire rest of the tank. So I can talk about making the kit modular. There are two hull tops, and the difference is a larger or smaller engine deck. And these attach with two big pegs that hold surprisingly well. So if you don't glue these down, you can paint them both and then pop off whichever one you're using to switch to the other. However, this change has no effect on the rules of bolt action, so I actually prefer the later hull, which is the slightly larger one, and I'll just glue that in place. Now there are pegs for the turret axis to hold them in place if you wanted to fix a particular turret and hull top combination. You should fit that before gluing down the hull top. But I'm not going to glue those pegs in, and that means that I can swap the turrets depending on which variant I want to field. There are now a few details for the hull, and I realise that one covers the gap where the track assemblies join. A nice feature to hide that join for sure, but as I wanted to have the track separate for painting, I had to make sure that it was going to line up correctly. And so I did that by gluing them to the lower piece with the tracks fitted, but not glued. The front of the hull has some hatches that can be positioned open, but with only one commander figure in the kit, I'll glue those closed. And a headlight goes in the middle. Unfortunately, and surprisingly, the headlight actually has a sink mark in the lens. Usually this only happens on big parts, as the plastic shrinks, something for the thermal moulding calculations to correct. Now it's a fairly easy fix. For me, I just put a blob of thick polystyrene cement over it, and that's going to form a smooth bubble, and once it dries, it's going to look similar to a glass lens. If you wanted to make the smaller hull top, or if you're making both, then these side panels glue on very easily around the piece. They overlap to form the correct angles and are moulded separate so that the rivets sit at the correct angle. You can't glue the front piece here into place if you want it modular. That front piece has a huge connection to the sprue, and I was confused for a moment where it was supposed to separate. Eventually I settled on just cutting it in the same plane as the rest of the part and making sure I had a flush flat surface, which does seem to be correct. In my case, I can glue this down to the hull, and if you wanted to have the hull tops Modular, you can glue this down to the main section of hull so that the upper piece slides in behind it and the pegs hold them in place. There is a machine gun barrel to go on the front as well. Just like the early hull top, the later hull top has armoured sides with rivets to be placed around and fit together with nice overlaps to ensure good positions. The rearmost sections are the hatches for the engine deck and they fit together nicely. At the rear of the hull goes some exhausts, and there are subtly different versions for the early and late hull tops. The difference is the length of the pipe, with a slightly longer one in the early section to line up with the smaller engine deck, and a slightly shorter one in the later one to line up with the larger engine deck. If you want to make this modular, you should be using the later exhausts, and that means that both hull tops will fit, although with the early hull top that does mean you will have an absolutely tiny, almost unnoticeable gap. If that matters, I'm sure you can find a way to add a bit of pipe to fill in that gap and glue them to the top of the early hull top. There are some extra details that can go on in different places. The jack and its arm I put on the right and the other tools on the left. Now we can finally move on to turrets, and I'll be mainly using the Shinhoto or improved turret, so I'll build that first. The main shape of the turret is built with side panels, roof and base all fitting together. And to make it easier, I put the gun into its position first, which has no elevation. Each of these parts has good keying to fit together with plenty of surface area for cement to bond. The turret is not symmetrical, and so the pieces only go together in the intended way, so check the instructions and dry fit pieces to get them to line up. I did notice that the gun's mantlet has to go over the top of the roof, but then underneath the sides, but as I built it in one go, the cement was still wet and I easily kind of nudged things around and get it to line up correctly. The machine gun barrel, oddly in the rear of the turret, a wire hook thing for the top, and then the commander's cupola are all required for both variants of turret, but with only one of each in the kit. A little kit bashing will be required. The hatches for the turret, however, are different between variants, so I'm using the later hatches with the later turret. As the commander is included with the kit, I'm going to position the hatch open so he can sit and look out the top. I also want to make these smaller early turrets so that I can swap between them, and that goes together in a different way. This time there is a core piece that the sides stick to, and again they have to go on in the intended way, so check the instructions and dry fit as you go. There is a separate gun from the Shinhoto turret, and I used some bits from my bits box to replace those parts that don't have duplicates. The rear facing machine gun barrel, the wire thing on the top, and then the cupola was 3D printed. I got the design a little bit off, so unfortunately I'm not going to actually be publishing my version of that. The last piece is the radio aerial, which is my favourite part of the whole kit because it just looks so distinct. After carefully cleaning up the aerial, it glues down onto the top of the turret. Now there's no specific keying here, but it does somewhat conform to the shape of the turret, so it's actually fairly easy to line up. What that means now is my Chiha Shinhoto is built with all its pieces, and I have the optional parts of the early hull to make an in-place position. For some really strange painting, the first colour going down is pink, followed immediately by yellow. Now this pink underlayer is a really cool trick to make yellow paint stand out nice and brightly, and this yellow is part of the camo pattern that the Japanese used in the period. It supposedly is meant to have a yellow stripe that looks like a ray of sunshine, which hides the shape of the tank, which is a nice idea. I'm not sure how effective it was. To make those stripes, I'm going to tear some strips of masking tape, making sure that the edges are uneven, and I'll lay those over the tank's hulls and turrets before spraying over the top with a light brown. I then added little random shapes of masking tape with torn wavy edges to create the different shapes that my camo pattern will be. And over the top of this, I sprayed again with some bruise red. And whilst this paint is quite saturated, and actually so is the yellow, I'll be using a wash to mute this down quite heavily. This style of using masking tape is not a technique that I've ever used before, so I'm kind of interested to find out how it's going to end up looking. And once I demasked, I had a look over it, and the saturated colours do look a bit garish at the moment, The shapes overall are pretty much how I wanted them to be, and close-ish to the historical camo shapes, so I'm pretty happy with it. I'll add some details around the tank now, using the transfers and the information in the instructions to make sure the transfers go in the correct place, and that's a really helpful feature. Base coating the tracks and some other details in metallics was all I really needed before I gave the whole model a wash to darken everything down and bring it all together, and to pick out the recesses of the sculpt. After the wash, I really didn't do much more work. I didn't even edge highlight it. My whole Japanese force is pretty dark in tone, and so this will match it quite nicely. With just a little last detail work, picking out here, this and that and the other, to complete the piece, ready to join the infantry that I painted in a single massive batch, and you can check out that video here or in the description. Let me know what you think of this build. I'm ED-SKaR, always will be, and thank you very much for watching.